Welcome to General Aviation Security Magazine's end-of-year discussion panel. I'm Dave Hook, the publisher of General Aviation Security Magazine, and your moderator for these panel discussions. We have with us 4 of our authors who have graciously agreed to be on the panel. First, we have Alan Armstrong, a practicing attorney who specializes in aviation law. Next, we have Dr. Daneil Benny, professor and holder of the Security Discipline Chair at Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University worldwide. Joe Corrao is our next panelist. Joe is a prolific writer and contributor to the magazine, as well as an avid aviator and lawyer. Finally, we have Andy Downs, the director of the 5/8 November Project. Welcome, and thank you all for being here. Here's what I'd like you to consider. What is the biggest threat to general aviation, and what is our biggest vulnerability? Dr. Benny, start us off, please.
Well, in my view, our biggest threat is traditional criminal activity at general aviation airports, and that would include vandalism to aircraft, theft of aircraft, and theft of avionics. So traditional crime, I think, is our biggest vulnerability. There's always the concern of terrorism, but I don't think obviously it's not as frequent as traditional criminal activity. And so general aviation community has to be proactive and prepare for this type of event.
Andy, your thoughts, please.
Regardless of the situation, one of the biggest problems and vulnerabilities that we have is law enforcement's perception of the pilot in command. We understand that the captain is in charge of everything that goes on with that aircraft and has the responsibility of the safety of everyone on board. Law enforcement views a captain, let's say in a hijacking or crisis situation, no different than the manager of a 7-Eleven. They have no say. Any information that comes from the captain is viewed as suspect, and that's a huge cultural shift in law enforcement since pre-9/11, where the pilot in command had the legal authority to refuse armed intervention in one of these scenarios. That no longer exists. And we need to reach out to law enforcement and meet with law enforcement, train with law enforcement about these issues, because if we're not all on the same team, that's a vulnerability that can be exploited by a potential terrorist or hijacker.
Joe, what do you think?
Well, Dave, in terms of security, I believe the largest threat facing general aviation is the TSA. After that, I would rank the threat of higher fees and taxes, which draw scarce resources away from investments in security, and the threat of well-intentioned action by Congress or the White House that has unanticipated and destructive consequences. As to the greatest vulnerability, I would say that is our continuing reliance on an aviation security paradigm designed 40 years ago to protect airliners from hijackers. Back in the day, hijackers wanted to go somewhere and get there alive, and they needed a functional airplane and a crew to do it. Today's suicide terrorists are interested only in killing people, and they don't care about surviving the attack. Our current tactics no longer match the threat, which creates gaping vulnerabilities. We need to rethink aviation security from the bottom up to close those vulnerabilities.
It's your turn, Alan.
The biggest threat to general aviation is the United States government. The prospect that the government will impose user fees as like some sort of European model. We've seen what has happened to general aviation in Europe. If it's going to cost you $100 to file an IFR flight plan, I mean, people are going to stop filing IFR flight plans. They'll be flying VFR in deteriorating weather, which we know is not good, because of the economics of filing a flight plan and incurring those user fees, and that's going to restrict aviation. You know, you look around, you go to airports today, and people tell you the operations at this airport are down 30% or 33% or 35% or something of that nature. Well, think about the margins of the FBOs. I mean, it could very well be that their profit margin is just about gone. So now we're going to add one more layer of bureaucracy, one more layer of complexity, one more layer of expense on aviators, and I'm concerned that if user fees were implemented by the U.S. government, that could be just about the death knell for general aviation. I think that's the biggest threat to general aviation is the U.S. government.
Back to you, Dr. Benny.
Really, just to follow up, with what I said before, and take into account some of the comments from the other members of the group here. Again, from a security standpoint, I think the biggest threat is traditional crime. We have to be concerned in preventing terrorism, but we have to preserve general aviation in many different ways. From the security standpoint, we need to be proactive and do our part and ensure that there is security at the airports, so we don't have the public concern that general aviation is a threat, which could lead to further mandates through TSA and the federal government. We have to make sure that everyone is aware of how important general aviation security is to the infrastructure and to our economy and really to our way of life. It all boils down to freedom. That's what the Constitution is about in this country, freedom to be individuals and private property rights, and we have to keep that focus. That's, I think, is some of the most important aspects of that.
Andy?
Well, as far as the economic future of general aviation, I think the user fees are very problematic. And in an effort to either create revenue from the government's perspective or add on unnecessary regulations, those things can happen very easily and very quickly and without full knowledge of the lawmakers as far as the unintended consequences. That's something we all need to keep in mind and keep fresh. I do think there needs to be a serious push from aviators on all levels, whether it's commercial or general aviation or otherwise, that we reach out to the law enforcement community to educate them on what a pilot in command's authority and responsibilities truly are.
What about you, Joe?
Well, Dave, I think the first round of responses covered that question pretty well. To be honest, I really have nothing much to add at this point.
Alan, you get the last word.
Yes, I appreciate the comments of Dr. Benny about criminal activity, although I don't see very much of that in my practice. Again, I see the government interaction with the pilots and the government interaction with the FBOs and the repair station certificate holders. And I do think that Joe has some very good comments about the paradigm of the flight deck in terms of the conventional wisdom has always been that you want to pacify the threat because he just wants to get to Havana. He just wants to go to some foreign country and needs an operable aircraft and an operable flight crew to do so, and that's no longer the objective, that this guy's objective is to kill himself and you in the process. So I think that Joe's clearly correct about that in terms of the threat of terrorists to aviation. But I think globally, from my perspective, and again I'm going to underscore my perspective, in terms of general aviation, I view the government as being the principal threat. Over-regulation, inept oversight, and then if we ever get to a European model, as I talked about earlier, where we have to pay for user fees, that's pretty much going to be, I think, the end of general aviation in the United States. We'll be on par with Great Britain with the minuscule representation of flying activity in society. Again, and I know I'm being somewhat repetitive, but from my perspective as a lawyer who fights and deals with the government on an almost daily basis, I think that the greatest threat to GA is the U.S. government.
Thank you, panelists, for sharing your thoughts with us.